Welcome back to the Special Focus. My name is Zahid Jadwat. You are tuned in to Salam Media, and I will be keeping you company right up until 8 o'clock this evening. So 25 minutes left until 8 o'clock, and so let's just get straight into it. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he is planning to effectively annex parts of the occupied West Bank in what would be a major and highly controversial act. The West Bank has been occupied by Israel since the 1967 Middle East War, but decades of difficult on and off talks between Israel and the Palestinians, both of whom assert rights there, have left its final status unresolved. Between 2.1 million and 3 million Palestinian Arabs live in the West Bank under both limited self-rule and Israeli military rule. The West Bank is also home to some 430,000 Israeli Jews, except those living in East Jerusalem. And these Jews live in 132 settlements and 124 smaller outposts built under Israeli occupation. The vast majority of the international community considers the settlements illegal under international law, though Israel and the US under the Trump administration dispute this interpretation. Now, let me welcome our guests for this segment of the show. Firstly, we have Mr. Dan Diker, who is the co-founder of the South Africa-Israel Policy Forum, and he was the former General Secretary of the World Jewish Congress. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. Salam alaikum from Israel, Palestine. Thank you very much for having me.
Indeed. And we also we were scheduled to speak to Mr. Na'eem Jeenah, who is the Executive Director of the Afro-Middle East Centre, AMEC. However, he's unable to join us, and he is and Ms. Motsoeneng is filling in for Mr. Jeenah. Thank you for joining us, Motsoeneng, as well.
Thank you for having me.
Motsoeneng?
Thank you for having me, Zahid. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I can hear you. Okay, so let's begin now. What would the annexation mean for the future of Israel and Palestine? You can start off, Motsoeneng.
So the annexation of the settlements basically in the West Bank, or what would become mostly a large part of the occupied West Bank, would essentially mean an extension of Israeli sovereignty, because as it currently stands, the settlements are already in occupied West Bank are already effectively under Israeli rule, even though there is a few exceptions in terms of how the laws are implemented compared to in Israel. So for Palestinians, this effectively means a total land grab. It has been quite the case even before this. Israel has been extending and even passing new settlements to be erected in the West Bank, effectively going against long-standing international law.
Okay, so Dan Diker, I think you might want to respond to that as well. So Motsoeneng feels that this is now going to go against international law should Israel go ahead with annexing parts of the West Bank. So just your thoughts on that quickly, Dan Diker, before we move on.
Well, with the greatest respect for Mrs. Motsoeneng, your other very distinguished guest, I'd like to just create some context for our discussion. Israel is not annexing anything. What is happening here, and this is really an issue of miscommunication, I think, from the Israeli government outwards, but everything that is happening here falls under the context, Zahid, of the U.S. administration's plan for regional U.S. peace. Remember, President Trump called this the deal of the century, and it's a $50 billion economic deal to help the Arab Muslim Middle East, including the Palestinians and the Lebanese and the Egyptians and the Jordanians, solve some very serious security and economic problems. And that's why it's a $50 billion regional deal. And this is something that has not been well communicated. So I want to clarify it. What Israel is doing, Zahid and Mrs. Motsoeneng, is to apply Israeli civilian law in certain areas where 500,000 Jews live and have lived for decades, in east of the 1967 lines. You know, every Israeli child, every Israeli woman and man over the age of 45 remembers when Jordanian tanks, 80 or 90 Jordanian tanks, were thrusting westward to destroy the territorial indefensible Israeli state, the small Jewish state in 1967. And therefore, every prime minister, from the progressive to the liberal to the more centrist and nationalist prime minister since 1967, that is 53 years of prime ministers have said that Israel would have to apply or retain the Jordan Valley in any future peace deal with the Palestinians. Now, as a final point, our Palestinian neighbors, who the vast majority of Israel want to come to terms with our Palestinian neighbors. In fact, just before this program, my Palestinian neighbor Allah just called me to wish me well, and he and I work on projects together in Jerusalem and just outside Jerusalem. And there is a tremendous amount of integration between Palestinians and Jews in the West Bank, as well as throughout Israel, where we have 1,300,000 Palestinian or Arab Israeli citizens with full democratic rights, 15 members of our parliament, 4 Palestinian Arab Israeli political parties. But what Israel is doing here is to apply civilian law to areas where Israeli Jews live, so that we can get the military law out, the civilian law in, and the Palestinian citizens would remain, Palestinian residents of the West Bank in areas that would be where Israeli civilian law would apply, would remain residents of the Palestinian pre-state authority. Let's remember, for the three of us, for this discussion, that Israel, by international agreement, has already passed 40% of the disputed West Bank to the Palestinian government, in addition to 100% of Gaza, which is now ruled by the Iranian-backed Hamas, Islamic Party and movement Hamas, which is the Muslim Brotherhood. So the only thing we're talking about here is sharing the remaining 60% of the West Bank. And what the Trump administration has suggested is that 50% would go to Israel because it's historically Jewish land, and 50% would go to our Palestinian neighbors. So that's a pretty good deal, 50-50. And in fact, that the Palestinians would have a very robust, very well-developed Palestinian state in 70% of the disputed West Bank. And then Israel would retain 30%. So finally, my last point here is that what Israel is considering doing now is not annexing unilaterally, because annexing means when one sovereign country annexes unilaterally the sovereign territory of another country. This is not sovereign territory, it's disputed territory. And Israel is going to apply civilian law to certain areas that under any future scenario would be part of the small Jewish and democratic state, not the Palestinian state.
But now you have mentioned the deal of the century, which has come with its own controversy as well. Mr. Diker, even the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has warned against the move and said shockwaves of annexation will last for decades. 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council have spoken out against an extension of Israeli sovereignty over what is deemed Palestinian territory under international law. Wouldn't this put even the future of Israel itself in jeopardy?
No, it would be exactly the opposite. I think that one of the things, and you just should know that I'm a dear friend of South Africa. I've been to South Africa many times. I've been there when it was before it was a free country and after it was a free country, and I'm very familiar with the profound political and social issues of South Africa. And let me just say, please, that our Palestinian leaders, and I'm very, very familiar and know very well some of the Palestinian leadership, they have refused 6 consecutive offers for peace. Let me just remind all 3 of us and our listeners that in 2000, Israel offered 92% plus land swaps of the entire West Bank. And in 2008, Israel offered 94.2% plus land swaps to offer the Palestinians 100% solution. And they said no, no, and no. And so what has happened here, quite different from what you suggested in your question, is a solution to Palestinian leadership rejectionism. Because what many people here in the peace camp are saying is if you've offered 100% solution, well, why on earth would Chairman Abbas say no, no, no every single time since 2000? And the answer is that they have a very different political agenda. Now, on the other hand, the very good people of the West Bank and the Palestinian side, and let me just say it's between 1.5 and 1.6 million. It's not anywhere close to the 3 million number that you quoted. And they deserve peace and dignity, and they have to have a prosperous independence. And I'm very much in favor of that. And the way I was in favor, as I struggled when I was a young man against apartheid in South Africa, I'm in favor of our neighbors having their dignity and their independence, as I am for our own small Jewish state. But we have to realize that there's a very big difference between the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people. I think you would notice with all of the comments that you've made about the 4 out of the 5 members of the permanent members of the Security Council, there are no demonstrations going on as we have this conversation in any Arab capital anywhere in the Middle East, nor are there demonstrations in any Palestinian city across the West Bank. So why is that? And the reason is that the vast majority of the Palestinian people want to be connected to Israel. They want to have Israeli healthcare, they want Israeli agriculture, they want Israeli economy, they want to have Israeli medicine, they want to have Israeli high tech, and they want to have Israeli democracy. What they don't want is the terror kleptocracy, unfortunately, and I say this with great pain in my heart, that has occurred, and you don't hear about this in South Africa, perhaps for political reasons, that has happened over the Palestinian people in Gaza and throughout the West Bank. But we do have to have a political compromise, that's true. But I will say this, as someone that has fought for peace his entire life, this particular peace blueprint has the possibility of creating a robust, dignified, just, and very prosperous Palestinian state. And therefore, you should see the Israeli move towards applying Israeli law, not as preventing peace, but as enabling peace. Because only certain areas where Israel will have to defend itself, because remember, the Middle East is today, unfortunately, a chain of failed Arab states because of the Islamic revolutions going on across the region, because of ISIS going on across the region, which is also threatening South Africa from Mozambique, and because of the Iranian regime's subversion of every single Arab state. And we fear that the Iranian regime, the radical Shia, would also undermine a fledgling emergent Palestine that would threaten Israel next door. So we have to protect ourselves, which we're entitled to do, as every South African man and woman and child is entitled to do, for your own sovereignty in the great country Republic of South Africa, in order to enable our neighbors to live peacefully and in order to enable ourselves to live peacefully.
Okay, and just for the listeners, I want to remind you that you can weigh in on this discussion. You can send us a comment via WhatsApp to 061-766-0355. Alternatively, you can tweet and tag @Salam Media using the hashtag The Special Focus. Matshidiso, just before we move on, I want you to comment, if you would like to, on what Mr. Dan Diker has just said about the annexation of parts of the West Bank.
Thank you, Ms. Zahid. I'd like to just say that, my learned colleague there invoked the so-called deal of the century by President Trump, but he also spoke a lot about, what Palestinians want. He also invokes his, apparently history of fighting for peace and knowing what South Africa was or what it was not, and which I find very offensive. He's speaking for Palestinians, he's also speaking for South Africans, but let's leave that for now. I'd like to also remind my colleague here that the so-called deal of the century did not include any Palestinians. No Palestinian was consulted in the so-called drafting of this plan. The Palestinian Authority, which boycotted the drafting of this plan, spearheaded by Jared Kushner, who's very close to Netanyahu, by the way, who's very close to the Israeli government, did so after President Donald Trump pronounced Jerusalem in December 2017 as the capital of Israel, going again against international law, because we know that internationally, Jerusalem is disputed. It's still supposed to be left for final negotiations between the two parties. As we know, also, my learned colleague, speaks about how Palestinians have apparently rejected peace deals, etc. Again, he forgets to mention that this was Israelis telling Palestinians what should be their terms and conditions to what they should negotiate. Palestinians have never changed their story. They've never changed the goalpost that Israel does. They've always said they want a Palestinian state within the 1967 lines with East Jerusalem as its capital. They've never changed it. But no, my learned colleague wants to tell me that, the 500,000 Jews that currently live on the stolen, occupied land that is rightfully owned by Palestinians have a historical claim for it, but totally disregards the fact that Palestinians also have a historical claim to the land. So yeah, I'm just pointing this out because he would like to have us believe, as South Africans who've gone through very much similar experience in this country, where the so-called deal of the century, our own very President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was in the struggle, by the way, Mr. Diker, who could have very much have experienced everything else. I might be younger than him. Has pronounced the US deal of the century as something that resembles the South African Bantu stance. So basically what this US plan proposes is a few Palestinian enclaves connected by roads that are specifically marked for Palestinians. We know currently, I have been to Palestine, by the way, Mr. Diker. I've been to Israel, where you have Israelis currently building roads that are specifically marked for settlers and not supposed to be driven by Palestinians, etc. I don't know what state does the so-called peace plan propose when the Palestinians themselves could never have their own sovereignty, could never have control over the land or the space, the land or the airspace in which the so-called state is supposed to be in the little enclaves that this peace plan proposes. But they must also not have any security because supposedly Israeli security would be threatened by a Palestinian state with a functioning military. So please do not even try and fool us here and say that the so-called deal of the century is thinking about Palestinians. The $50 billion is supposedly supposed to by the silence of the Palestinians, make them forget that in 1948, Israeli chased them out of their homes, out of their lands, and they must totally forget that you have Palestinians living right now in the diaspora in different countries, effectively stateless, because they cannot have citizenship where they are currently in South America, in the neighboring countries, Lebanon and Jordan, but they also cannot have Palestinian statehood because there is no Palestinian state, but they're also not even allowed to even return. But Jews have the right to return to Israel all over the world. So Mr. Diker, please do not try and patronize us, because this is very patronizing for you to even say that you have Palestinians that that like to be part of Israel. What is wanting to be part of Israel? Wanting to be part of an ongoing occupation, militarized state that actually extends military law to Palestinians while extending civilian law to Israelis. Netanyahu himself has said after the annexation happens in the West Bank, Israeli civilian law will not be extended to the Palestinians in these areas. So do not try and create a rosy picture, whereas the reality on the ground is that, yes, I completely agree with you. A lot of Palestinians do not see themselves or agree with a lot of things that the Palestinian Authority does, but that's fine. That's a matter of Palestinians for them to decide. Every time, historically, Israel has always decided what should and what shouldn't happen for Palestinians. You're doing the same thing right now, even telling me as a South African what the peace or what apartheid looked like and how what is happening now in Palestine is completely different because you're supposedly a fighter for peace. Thank you, Zahid.
And we have just 6 minutes remaining until the end of the show, so we'll have to keep the responses as brief as possible. Just looking at one of the comments which has come through here on the YouTube live. So Farhana Karamutala says, Mr. Diker is living in his own alternate reality. Please try selling Palestinians who have had their homes destroyed, their land given to settlers living in the largest open-air prison in the world. We have seen the wall surrounding Bethlehem. We have seen the dehumanizing checkpoints, the Israel-only roads. The majority of Palestinians live under occupation and siege. He goes further by weaponizing Islam to justify the occupation. And just as I give you an opportunity to respond to that, Mr. Diker, I also have a question for you as well to further this discussion. And so, in a poll published on the 8th of June, just over a third of Israelis said that they supported the annexation plan, which includes the provisions for a Palestinian state. And I'm sure there has been quite widespread reports of recent protests taking place in the capital, Tel Aviv. And so why would Israel go ahead with such an unpopular move, Mr. Diker?
Her on my TV that what you just said is complete propaganda and absolute nonsense. You don't understand the facts, you don't understand the context, and therefore for you to patronize me and to say that I'm going to answer for you, I'm not going to answer for you. I'm going to tell you that I understand the context of South Africa, but I've been living here for 30 years fighting for peace with my Palestinian colleagues in the Palestinian Authority, in Jordan, and throughout the Middle East. And if Mrs. Motsoeneng had done the least bit of homework, if she knew anything what she was talking about, she would ask, why is it that every single Arab state showed up in Bahrain in May 25th, 2019 as the first part of this peace process, and the only Arab government that wasn't there was Mr. Abbas. And the Arab states, for the first time publicly, began to criticize the Palestinians because they are completely isolated themselves in the Arab world. They've isolated themselves among the Palestinian public, and so to try to pass off this absolute nonsense that there are settler-only roads, when right outside my door, in road number 60, Palestinian and Israeli cars go together every single day into Jerusalem, out of Jerusalem, and in all directions, north, south, east, and west. That's the biggest bunch of propagandistic nonsense, and you should. And as someone who has been to Israel and been to the Palestinian areas, I would expect a greater amount of intellectual honesty from you. As far as Israel is concerned, let me just say that there is a wall-to-wall consensus on the Trump plan for peace. And that includes the vast majority of Israelis, and that also includes, by the way, the vast majority of the 1.3 million Palestinian or Israeli Arabs that live inside the democratic state of Israel. So to try to paint Israel as anything else but a small, struggling democratic state that has rights, if you've ever opened a Bible, which the vast majority of 60 million South Africans do, and I've been in your churches on Sunday, and I've heard all of them praise the God of Israel, praying to the God of Israel, and supporting the Jewish state. That is the reality that we live in. We have a political dispute with our Palestinian neighbors. It has nothing to do with the challenges that South Africa has gone through, with which I completely sympathize and support South Africans in their very important historical saga and push for peace and for equality. But what we have here in Israel is a totally different reality that is based on the Oslo Peace Accords, an agreement with the PLO, by agreement with the Europeans, with the UN, with Norway, with Egypt, and with Jordan. And so therefore, I think that our friends in South Africa listening to this program should understand that we have a political conflict between two national movements over some remaining disputed territory, and not some copy situation of what was in South Africa. You do a disservice to your listeners by trying to compare it to South Africa. But if you really want to help the Palestinians, you should answer why it was that they're the only Arab government that refused to show up at the US-sponsored economic workshop, $50 billion workshop that every single Arab country supported in the Middle East for the sake of peace with Israel, the Palestinians, against the ascendant Iranian regime.
Okay.
I can definitely answer that question, Mr. Diker. The reason that those Arab states showed up, even at the pronouncement of the so-called deal of the century in Washington, where the ambassador of the UAE and Bahrain were present, as you rightly state, is because of its own geopolitical strategic alliances with the US and Israel in the region currently. The biggest what the Arab states see currently as their biggest geopolitical threat is Iran, and aligning with Israel, which obviously is anti-Iran, and the US helps their geostrategic interests. And the Palestinians have just suddenly become collateral damage for these Arab countries. If you look at their own track record, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are currently engaged in a senseless war in Yemen. They are funding, a war that has ravaged and devastated millions of people. In Libya, they're supporting warlord Khalifa Haftar against, going after a UN-recognized government. So please do not tell me about, do not try and legitimize this US deal of the century by invoking the attendance of Arab states that have long given up the support for Palestinians' right to self-determination for their own geopolitical strategic interests.
Okay, it's just gone 1 minute past 8 o'clock, and unfortunately, that's where we are going to have to leave it because time is against us as usual. But thank you so much for your time to both of the panelists. Motsoeneng, thank you for your time, researcher at the Afro-Middle East Centre. Thank you for your time, Motsoeneng.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Dan Diker, who is, in fact, the co-founder of the South Africa-Israel Policy Forum and who was the former General Secretary of the World Jewish Congress. Thank you so much for your time as well.
Thank you for inviting me. I deeply appreciate it. And alaikum salam to all our friends in South Africa.
Unfortunately, that's where we are going to have to leave it, as much as there's quite a bit more to discuss. And we'll have to leave it there for today. So from myself, Zahid Jadwat, and the team, thank you for tuning in this evening, and we wish assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.